I want to ask you this question. Is Jesus intruding in your life? Most people don't like intrusions. Many times, Jesus is seen as an intruder. Have any of you ever seen this commercial? Mayhem. It's everywhere. It's a commercial for insurance company, right? And this guy, his name is Mayhem, and where he shows up, everything falls apart. Everything's going just fine until he shows up, and he intrudes on people's peace and goodness. If they're mowing the yard and he shows up, all of a sudden the rocks start spitting out and it breaks windows and dents the house and all of that. If they're at a football game, he shows up and somebody puts the grill when it's still hot in the trunk of the car and the car explodes. Somebody is on vacation and they're away from their home, but they're monitoring their home with their smartphone and they see the video camera outside of their home. Mayhem shows up. He looks at the camera and he smiles and he takes a baseball bat and he beats the window of the car and steals the car, runs over the mailbox. Over and over and over. Whenever Mayhem shows up, there's pain, there's suffering, there's discord. He intrudes on things that are going just right. Has anybody wanted to ever embrace an intruder, a prowler, somebody who cuts in on things when everything is going just right? You're having a conversation with somebody, and somebody starts calling your name from the other side of the room. They're intruding on your conversation, or they walk between you and the person you're speaking with. They've intruded. It's rude. We don't like it. We don't embrace intruders. Not in our conversations, not in our domain. What's our domain? The things that are ours, in our homes. You wake up in the middle of the night and somebody's in your living room that you don't know. You're not going to embrace him. You're not going to say, hey, welcome. Glad you're here. Pull up a chair. No, you're going to call the police. You're going to defend your domain. You're going to do something because that's your domain and they're intruding. Somebody in your backyard that doesn't belong there, you're going to defend your yard. Even if it's the neighbor's dog that's intruding in your yard, you don't want somebody in your domain. That's just the way that we're wired. Somebody comes into your home and they just open the pantry, look in the fridge. You're going to have an odd feeling about that. Now, there's sometimes when we say, hey, make yourself at home. Anything in the pantry you want? Anything in the fridge? Get it. Sit down in the car. Feel free to turn the radio station. That's different. People aren't intruding in those occasions. We've invited them to take part in whatever our domain is. But if we haven't invited and people are intruding, it's an odd thing. And sometimes we see that our life or our lifestyle is sometimes intruded upon. Somebody was saying this morning, I think Tom was saying about the daylight savings time is coming. And somebody was saying that this is controlled now by Congress. And some people see that as an intrusion. And there's a lot of other ways that people see the government intruding upon our lives, legislating things that affect our daily lives, whether it's morality or it's our taxes or whatever. Many people push back on government intrusion. And then there's other things that people want to fight back on, lifestyles that people have that they're happy with. But sometimes they're intruded upon. A third party enters a relationship. That's an intrusion on what God has called holy. We don't like that kind of intrusion. There's all kinds of intrusions that are in our life, and it causes offense. And when intrusions happen, mayhem seems to take place. It seems to be a thing that we say everything was going fine. And you know, there are some people who love this world and the things of this world and see this world as fine, but they're always in struggle. Even the disciples of Jesus Christ then and the disciples of Jesus Christ now are sometimes seen as intruders. Those who take a righteous stance are ridiculed and called intolerant and intruders on other people's lives. The disciples in multiple places in the New Testament, there was people who pushed back on them because they liked the way their life was, and they did not realize that their life was miserable and that their souls were lost. But they would push back. The Apostle Paul goes to Thessalonica, And he has some success there, teaching the gospel of Jesus Christ, and people are converted. But then some people are offended by that, and they say, these who have turned the world upside down have come here too. I don't know if that's where this cliche started, but isn't that a strange thing to say? The world has been turned upside down. Imagine walking outside of your house and you're stepping on clouds and looking up at the ground. The world is turned upside down. Nothing makes sense of a world that's turned upside down. This is what they were saying about Paul and the other disciples. They were turning the world upside down. Things didn't make sense to them anymore. They were used to a certain way of life. It was ingrained in them, and now there's resurrection from the dead, and there's a standard of righteousness. It's an improvement, but they didn't see it. They saw it as an intrusion. In Acts chapter 19, Paul goes to Ephesus, and he begins to do the same thing, teach the gospel of Jesus Christ, and people are converted to Jesus Christ. People realize that this is the way things should be, and they're converted. But in their conversion, that means that they leave their pagan ways and their idols. There's a man there. I shared his name with you a few weeks ago, Demetrius. He's a silversmith at Ephesus. He made his living, along with other people, making these silver trinkets for the idol god Diana. But when people began to leave the idol god, he gathered his people together and he says, hey, this man who is preaching Jesus, he's impeding into our prosperity, our way of life. And he's telling people that these are not gods at all. And so he caused a riot, a huge uproar, lasted for hours. People were hurt. Paul had to be restrained, otherwise they would have torn him apart. Because this message seems to be intruding into their way of life. But it wasn't just his disciples. Jesus was the first one who was seen as an intruder when he was only bringing good things to this world. If you have your Bibles open to Mark chapter 3, I want to share with you, is Christ really an intrusion here? And if we look at Mark chapter 3, beginning in verse 1 through 6, we find that Jesus heals a man on the Sabbath. He entered the synagogues, and there was a man there who had a withered hand. Mark chapter 3, verse 1. Some versions say that he had a shriveled hand. Don't know if I completely understand this, but he was a man with a disability. And so they began to watch to see what Jesus would do. They wanted to find a way to accuse him. If he would heal on the Sabbath day, then maybe they could say he had done work and he had violated the old law. But Jesus didn't violate the old law. Jesus came to fulfill the old law. He honored the old law. He interpreted the old law the way that it was meant to be. This is what we're studying in Wednesday night Bible class. And so they watch to see what he will do. And so he tells the man in verse 3, step forward. Oh, now they've got him. But he asks a question first. Is it lawful on the Sabbath to do good or to evil, to save or to kill? And they kept silent. Of course they had to keep silent because they could no longer accuse him. He made sense. The interpretation of the Sabbath now had a deeper and a better and a more righteous meaning. And so he looked around at them in anger, and he was grieved at the hardness of their heart because they didn't care about this man. All they wanted to do was to set up Jesus. Jesus says to the man, stretch out your hand, and he restored them this hand just as whole as the other. But in verse 6 it says, the Pharisees went out and immediately plotted with the Herodians against him, how they might destroy him. Jesus comes on the Sabbath. He explains the Sabbath to them. He heals a man, and all they want to do is destroy him. They want him ruined. For what? Because he'd done good? Because he'd explained the old law the way that it was meant? No, he was intruding. They were happy with the way things were. They were happy with their own interpretations of the law. They were happy with letting the people who were hurt stay hurt. He intruded on all of their dysfunction, their disorder, and their pain. Well, if you're in Mark, just stay there. We're going to go through here for a few more. If you look at Mark chapter 5, in verses 1 through 20, there's the story of the man who's demon-possessed. They're on the other side of the Sea of Galilee, and there's a man who's there who's bound. They tried to bind him with chains, but they couldn't. He's demon-possessed by many demons, and he breaks the chains, breaks the shackles. He's living among the tombs there, and he's crying out all night. Friends, this doesn't seem so far removed from so many who we love and who we know and those who are in our community. People who are under the sway of the devil, people who self-inflict People who stay up all night and cry out and are living in darkness. That was this man. He had hurt himself. He'd cut himself over and over and over. And all of the people of the town seemed to be okay with it as long as he stayed where things are morbid, by the tombs. And he didn't bother them. Well, Jesus comes and he confronts this man, and the spirits that are within him, they speak out. And Jesus says, "What is your name?" in verse 9. And they say, "My name is Legion, for we are many." And they begged him earnestly in verse 10 that he would not send them out of the country. And he says, and in verse 11, there's a large herd of swine that are feeding over near the mountains. And the demons begged him, saying, "Send us to the swine that we may enter them." This is the power of Jesus. He has the kind of power, the kind of presence where even the demons begin to beg, "Please, don't send us too far away. Just send us into those swine." He says, "Go." And they go. And they go into the swine, and there's about 2,000 swine. And they jump off of the edge of the cliff, and they die. And the man who was plagued with all of these demons is now free of all of them. In verse 15 it says, "Then they came to Jesus." This is the people from the town. They came to Jesus and saw the one who had been demon-possessed and had a legion sitting. He's clothed and he's in his right mind. And they were afraid. These are the people who were the feeders of the swine. And in verse 17 it says, they begged and pleaded with him to depart from their region. These weren't Jewish people. They were on the other side of Galilee. The swine was their income. A lot like Demetrius. This is where they had their prosperity, from the swine. But now they're gone. They've jumped over the cliff and they said, "Get out of here, depart, leave us alone. You are intruding on our way of life." And so on one occasion, even the Jews, they want to destroy him. Now those who are outside, they plead with him, "Depart, get away. We don't want your mayhem." Well, let's look at another place. Still the same chapter, verses 21 through 43, we have the story of a man named Jairus. Jesus comes back to this side of the Galilee, and he's met with a ruler of the synagogue. His name is Jairus in verse 22. And he begged him earnestly, saying, "My little daughter lies at the point of death. Come and lay your hands on her that she may be healed, and she will live." Finally, we have somebody who's inviting Jesus into their life. Their life is dealing with sin and death. Or not sin necessarily, but sickness and death. "Come into my home." Jesus says, "Okay, I will." He goes. But when he gets there, before he gets there, somebody says, "Don't bother him. The little girl's dead." And Jesus says, "Don't be afraid, only believe." We come towards the end of the chapter. He permits, in verse 37, Peter and James and John to come in there with him. And he came to the house of the ruler of the synagogue in verse 38, and they saw a tumult, an uproar that was there, and those who wept and wailed loudly. Then he came in and he said to them, "Why make such commotion and weep? The child is not dead, but sleeping." And there's you can read the other writings about this story. Many times, though, Jesus uses sleep as a way, or Jesus and the apostles use sleep as a way of describing death. But notice verse 40. They ridiculed him. Well, he put them on the outside, and he took the mother and the father in there where the child was. Peter, James, and John was with him. And he took the child by the hand, and he says, "Talitha cumi," which is translated, "Little girl, I say to you, arise." And immediately the girl arose and walked, and she was 12 years of age. And they were overcome with great amazement. But some of them ridiculed him. He comes to a place where he's invited, and they ridicule him. Can you imagine what Jairus is thinking? I've invited this man to come and to help my daughter. You guys say that you're grieving with me, but now you've turned to ridicule. You ridiculed a guest in my house. This is a time of grief. This is a time of loss, but now it's a time of hope, because he says, "Believe." And I want to see what's going to happen. But they ridiculed him. Were they ridiculing him because he thought that she wasn't dead? Were they ridiculing him because they thought they knew more about it? Were they ridiculing him because they thought that they knew more about death and life than even Jesus? For whatever reason, he seems to be intruding on their grief party, and they ridicule him. And then if we go to one more place, in Mark chapter 6, Jesus is rejected in his own hometown. He goes to his own country. His disciples follow him. And again, in verse 2, it's the Sabbath. And they began to teach, or he began to teach in the synagogues. And many hearing him were astonished, saying, "Where did this man get these things? And what wisdom is this with which he is given to him, that such mighty works are performed by his hands?" Well, they've heard what he's done. Maybe they've even seen some of the things that he's done, and they listen to his teaching. You would think that they would embrace it. This is the man who raises people from dead. This is the man who heals people who are disabled. This is the man who preaches hope. This is the man who was prophesied about for so many years. But no, they say, this is just the carpenter's son. In verse 3, the son of Mary, the brother of James and Joseph and Judas and Simon. And these are his sisters here with us. So in verse 3 it says that they were offended. They were offended at him. In another place, in Luke chapter 4, after Jesus is preaching in the synagogue of his hometown, the story gives more detail. They take him outside, push him outside of the town so that they can push him over the edge. They wanted to kill him. They were happy with the things the way that they were. They were happy with Jesus just being the carpenter's son, but not the Messiah. It's as if he was intruding on them and they were offended. Now, why would people be offended by such things? I mean, there's destruction, there's pain, there's suffering, there's death. All of these are not the work of God. And Jesus comes sharing good news and healing and spiritual wellness in life. Why are they offended at this? Why do they see this as an intrusion? I think that we find the answer right here in 1 John chapter 5. It says that we know that we are God, that we are of God, and the whole world lies under the sway of the wicked one. Some versions say lies in wickedness, or under the control of the evil one, or under the power of the evil one, or lies in the evil one. The idea is this, that the world is evil because of the pressure, the power, and the influence of the devil. And if the devil has this kind of a dominion where the whole world is under his sway, it's no surprise that godliness is seen as an interruption. That godliness is seen as something that is intrusive to the normal way of life. Christ and his disciples, even today, are often ridiculed and seen as intruders. Those who don't belong, those who infringe, and those who overstep their bounds. Challenge the complacent. You'll be accused of encroaching in someone's freedom. Speak hope when people are content with hopelessness and you're overstepping your boundaries. Condemn sin and you're invading individuals' rights. Love life. Stand for it, even for the unborn, and you're likely to be accused of infringing. Why? How could senselessness seem like sense? How could wrong seem like right? How could the struggle for goodness be passionately and violently opposed? Why? Because the world is under the sway of the devil. But what if? What if complacency and hopelessness and sin and death were the intruders? Not the standard. Not the expectation. And what if righteousness and life were the way things were supposed to be? What if the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit were the standard bearers and the devil and his minions were the ones who were the gate crashers? Well, that would turn somebody's world upside down, wouldn't it? And that's what happened. That's the way it's supposed to be. Now, I walked into the Bible class and the adult class for just a minute this morning, and I heard Steve saying something that want to share with you too. It's as if we're guided by the same Spirit, the same word right here. If you go back to Genesis chapter 1 through 3, I want you to understand this is where so many of these things take a turn. In Genesis chapter 1 and 2, we have a story about the first things and about the established things. We're first introduced to God. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. This is Elohim, the mighty, awesome, all-powerful creator. And then we're introduced to his creation, the first of everything. The first of the trees and the herbs, the first of the animals, the first of man, all of the first. And then we're established to the processes of how things are established in the beginning. There's regeneration, where they're going to continue after their own kind. And there's man's dominion that is established there. And there's man's service to till and to keep the garden there. There's rules to live by. Don't eat from this tree. There's life there. Life just beaming from every place, every nook and every corner. And there's relationships there. Relationships between Adam and Eve that seems good at first. There's a relationship between God and man where it seems intimate and close. There's no embarrassment. There's no sin. It's a sinless place. And all was the way that it was supposed to be. But then chapter 3 comes, and we have intrusive things. And we have things that are now altered. It's in chapter 3 where we find that the devil, the serpent, the one that we read about in Revelation 3, the serpent, who is the devil, Satan, enters the scene. And he begins to question Adam and Eve. He begins with Eve, really, at least in this place. Did God really say not to eat from this tree? He said she says that he said not only to eat of it, don't touch it, but if you go back and you look, she added something to that. We'll surely die. Oh, no. You won't die. And somehow he shows her that not only is it pleasing for the eye, but it's good to eat. Maybe he demonstrates for her. Don't know. So she takes it. And we're thinking, Adam, do something about this. Tell him to leave. Tell her, don't do it, Eve. Don't take it. Knock it out of her hand. Do something, Adam, but he just stands there. And she eats the fruit that they said don't eat of. Now she has rebelled against God. She's done something that he said don't do. Then she passes it to Adam. Don't do it, Adam. Well, maybe just one bite. Later on, they realize now, no more innocence. There's humiliation. There's sin. There's grief. There's remorse. And on top of all of this, now we realize that since we're not innocent anymore, we need to cover ourselves up. And they sew fig leaves together. And the Lord comes walking in the garden. Can you imagine being Adam and Eve hearing those footsteps? Adam, Eve, where are you? Well, I think he knew where they were, and I think he knew what they had done. Could you imagine being the Lord? Parents, have you ever been in a situation where you're walking into a place that you know you don't want to find what you're going to find? Or walking into a hospital, you know you're going to find what you don't want to find? Those are difficult steps to take, aren't they? The Lord's taking one step after another. Why were you here? Well, we were hiding because we were naked. Who told you were naked? Well, Adam says, this woman that you gave me, she gave me the fruit and I ate it. And he turns to Eve and she says, well, the serpent that was here, he said it was okay. He gave me the fruit, I ate it. And then he turns to the serpent and he shares all of these curses now. You're not going to be able to live in the garden anymore. Adam's going to have to work by the sweat of his brow, and there's going to be thorns and thistles coming up in the ground. She's going to have pain in childbearing. She's going to long for her husband. And to the serpent, he has a curse for the serpent as well, who is the devil. Things are changed. Things are changed, and there's implications to all of this that takes place now. By beginning the story with the creation instead of the fall, Scripture proclaims categorically that sin is the intruder. It was sin who intruded. Sin is not the creativity of God, but sin does not belong. The devil is the gate crasher. He is the trespasser. He is the one who's the stalker, the interloper, the invader, the imposter, the intruder. And what he brought to the residents of earth and into the garden was sin and death. It was not asked for. It was not useful. It was unwanted, it was unwelcome, it was undesirable, it was unnecessary, it was uninvited. Yet it was the devil who barged in with it. He took up residence, and only a couple chapters into the Bible we find that the whole world has become desensitized to the devil and to his sin that he brought. In fact, they longed for it. In fact, they became they longed for it so much that they lived for it, and it prevailed until the whole world was wicked except for Noah and his family. The intruder could have been denied, but Adam didn't do it, and neither did Eve. The prowler can be resisted and the prowler can be exposed, but many overlook the prowler. Instead, they embrace the prowler and his ways. They even rally for him today, and they call their lust for his ways their rights. And while immorality is legalized, and while righteousness is protested, the mayhem smiles while he sits at the table, lounges on our couches, and walks on our sidewalks. Where there was unity and relationships, it's been replaced with alienation and with discord. While the tears flow and the anxiety peaks and fear paralyzes and death grabs us one by one, the intruder and all that he brought to this world, they tell us God is the intruder, and people buy it. I was given a book a few months ago by Caleb, and several weeks ago I read this passage. And this is what the author writes on this topic. He says, the Bible does not describe an eternal struggle between good and evil. Sin is not an eternal principle, a necessary or structural element of either the universe or human beings, or the product of God's creative intent. Nor does Genesis seek to make sense of sin, to make rational room for it in our cognitive universe. Sin remains ever a riddle, ever absurd, ever irrational. And this is Genesis 3. So what do we learn from the first 3 chapters in Genesis? Some people merely see this as an introduction to God and to His creation, and certainly we are introduced to God and to His creation, and there's a lot that we can draw from this. Some people only see the first part of Genesis as a rebuttal for evolution, and certainly it is that. But something that most people overlook is that this is a documentation of the event that disrupted humankind's experience with God and with the world that God created around us. People who study Genesis often overlook the important theological point. Our experience in God's world and with God Himself has been compromised. Sin is not normal. Sin is not natural. It never fits. It is the intrusion. And so when the intruder comes, and when they embrace the intruder, and the Lord has the opportunity to address it, notice what He says to the intruder. In Genesis chapter 3 and verse 15, He says, I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your seed and her seed. He shall bruise your head, and you shall bruise his heel. We have a declaration here of war. This is a declaration of war. He shall bruise your head. You'll bruise his heel. In other words, He's going to walk on you. He's going to smash you into the ground and step on you. That is a declaration of war. That there would be a descendant who would come. That's the seed. One who would come who would crush the head of Satan. But notice that it's not war against humankind, but a war against Satan. That God has hostility towards Satan and sin and death. And that's good for us because that is the enemy. That is the intrusion. And Jesus came, and He is that seed. We begin reading about that seed right here in Genesis chapter 3, and then we read about the seed of Abraham who will bless this world, and it's confirmed with Abraham, with Isaac, with Jacob, even down through David. We come to Luke chapter 3, and we read the lineage of Jesus, and it goes all the way back through David, and from Jacob to Isaac, Abraham, all the way back to Adam and Eve. Jesus is that seed. He is the one who delivers a death blow to death itself. In fact, that's why He came. It's called redemption. Notice what the passage says in 1 John chapter 3 and verse 8. Speaking of Jesus, for this purpose the Son of God was manifested. For this purpose the Son of God came into being, that he might destroy the works of the devil. This is the fulfillment of that promise in Genesis chapter 3. That's why he came. He's that seed. He is the fulfillment of that promise to destroy the works of the devil. Now we know that Jesus had multiple missions when he came here. Luke 19:10 came to seek and to save that which was lost. John chapter 10, he came that we might have life. Remember, the intruder came that they might have death. Jesus came that we might have life and have it abundantly. We know that he came to fulfill the old law. But we also know that he came to destroy the works of the devil. This is the way the Apostle Paul would say it. But now Christ is risen from the dead, and he has become the first fruits of those who have fallen asleep. That is the poetic way of saying those who have died. For since by man came death, by man also came the resurrection of the dead. For as in Adam all die, even so in Christ all shall be made alive. And so we have sin coming. Adam didn't stop it. Adam embraced it. And now death rules through one man. But through one man, we have life. That is Jesus Christ. This one man is the antithesis of the intruder. Where the intruder brought deception, Christ brings truth. Where the intruder brings sin, Christ brings righteousness. Where the intruder brings death, he brings life. Where the intruder brings destruction, he brings restoration. Where the intruder brings loss, he brings redemption. And in Colossians we read this, having wiped out the handwriting of the requirements that was against us, which was contrary to us, he has taken it away, taken it out of the way, having nailed it to the cross. Speaking of the old law. That's why we're not under the old law anymore. Jesus fulfilled the old law. He nailed it to the cross, but notice what else he did at the cross. Having disarmed principalities and powers, he made a public spectacle of them, triumphing over them in it. He made a public spectacle of them. Isn't that why we put motion detectors on our lights at night for outside, so that we can make a public spectacle of any intruders? That it'll light up and it'll show them who they are and that they're not welcome there? This is what Jesus did at the cross. And he disarmed the principalities and the powers. He is the seed who would deal the crushing blow to Satan. The seriousness of sin is seen by the blood stains on the cross. He did this by going to the cross. Now, would you say that it was worth it? An intruder comes, they embrace him, they follow him, and now the world says, no, God, you're the intruder. But Jesus dies, and the blood is on the cross in order that he might destroy what the intruder did. Was it worth it to shed the blood for that? The toll of destroying the works of the devil is the body that was given at the cross. Was it really worth it? People laughed at him. People ridiculed him. People wanted to destroy him. People were offended by him. People told him to leave. Was it worth it? Well, I want you to remember it was worth it to God. That's why he sent him. You are worth it. That's why he came, to destroy the works of the devil. So I ask you then, who is the intruder? And who is the Redeemer? And who is the Savior? Ask the man with the withered hand. Was Jesus intruding in your life? Now he can pick up his cups and his fork and he can go to work. No, Jesus didn't intrude in my life. He healed my life. Ask the man who was healed from the demon possession. Did Jesus intrude in your life? No. I can think clearly now. I can return to my home. I can be with my family. I can heal from these self-inflicted wounds. Ask Jairus. Did Jesus intrude in your life? Everybody in your home was offended by him. Ask Jairus as he sits on the front porch with his daughter who's now alive. Ask anybody who's embraced Christ rather than rejected him. They've come to know who the intruder is. They'll stand against the intruder, and on the day of the final resurrection, there will be no more mayhem. Everyone will know. And those who thought that God was intruding, those who rallied against Christ and his disciples, they'll realize that he wasn't intruding. He was saving us from the intrusion of Satan. Now imagine for a minute the regret to find out that you've embraced a thief, a liar, and a murderer. But also imagine the joy when everything is reconciled back to the Creator. So I leave you with this thought. Who is really intruding in your life? Let's stand. Let's sing.